So we're together virtually. Anthony Brandt, David Eagleman. Amazing new book, Runaway Species. First off, I mean, this is a book about creativity, which of course is so collaborative in so many ways. Can you just say a word about how you two got together and how this collaboration worked in creating the book itself?
Yeah, it was basically we had a lunch meeting where we just got on the subject of creativity, and 3 hours later we thought, oh my gosh, we need to write a book together. And one of the things that excited us a lot was the idea of telling the story of creativity by putting the arts and the science together alongside of each other.
And just to be clear, Tony and I have known each other for a long time. We were just having a coffee to catch up on stuff, but Tony actually hosts this Music in the Mind conference, and I'd spoken at that, and we'd sort of been very interested in the intersection between art and science for a long time.
It's so great to see. I've just finished writing a book about kind of long-term decision making, and I've written a bunch of things about innovation in the past, but it was really striking to me how much overlap there was in terms of decision making, not just kind of innovation. And one of the things that is so powerful, and I'm so fascinated with in terms of the kind of neuroscience of this, is the capacity of the human brain to build these as if scenarios or simulations, and how important that is to us as a species. And it's one of those things that we do so well that we don't ever think about how complicated and hard it is. But can you talk a little bit more about what that really means?
Yeah, this is one of this is probably the thing that makes our species really special. It happened, the expansion of the human brain, which was a genetic tweak. We don't know why it happened, but it allowed this small species in Africa to take over the entire planet, and now, moving to the moon and Mars pretty soon. So, as part of the expansion of the cortex, which is this wrinkly bit on the outside, we are able to generate these what-if scenarios, imaginary things that haven't yet happened. And this is a key job of intelligent brains is to do this. In fact, we spend very little time living in the here and now. We spend most of our time thinking about possibilities. And that tweak is what really allowed us to massively succeed as a species.
And this was what was revealed in those early studies in the 90s with what they started calling the default network, right? That when you looked at brain scans of people who were allegedly in a resting state and not focusing on a task, there was all this activity they were seeing. And it turned out what they were doing was kind of daydreaming and thinking like, well, what if I did this? And what if I did this? And what if this happened? Or if I took this other job, whatever. And that actually uses up a lot of processing power. But again, it's so much a part of our innate talent, so we don't even think of it as a skill.
Yeah, we often think about, what's so great about language is that we can talk about what's happening and what's going on in the present. But actually equally powerful about human language, unlike any other language of way other animals communicate, is that we can share our what-if scenarios with each other and talk about what might have been or what could be. And again, like you said, Stephen, it's so ordinary and commonplace that we don't think twice about it, but it's the difference between us and everybody else out there in the animal world.
It's a funny thing. Oh, sorry, Dave, go on.
Oh, I was just going to say, just alley-ooping off what you had said, Stephen, it's just this issue of, the brain essentially runs, it spends some amount of its energy monitoring the outside world for new information, but the rest of all the brain's activity is chewing on the inputs that it's already had and building this internal model, this construction of what it thinks is going on out there and what could happen.
Well, it's one of the things I've always thought was so interesting about the role of storytelling, that, and there's been a kind of evolutionary psych argument about this over the years, that the importance of storytelling in human culture, we see this in all cultures, people tell stories, but by definition, stories are lies. They're like made up things, they're untruths, and yet people are fascinated by it, and why the brain would be so interested in things that are by definition not true. Seems weird if you think about it, if you take a step back, but if you think about it in terms of that ability to build the what-if scenarios, which are themselves also kind of fiction, and the importance of that, then suddenly storytelling has a different kind of impact, I think.
Yeah, exactly. Truth is, as of course you know, truth is not the right metric that the brain cares about. It cares about possibility,
Right.
And then figures out ways to say, well, could I make this true? Including very basic things like, what motor movement would I have to do to make it true that I'm holding my teacup in my hand? I'm simulating all kinds of possibilities. Well, maybe I could do something with my elbow, or maybe do it with my feet, or whatever. And then I come up with one where I'm using my hand, and then I can make that true later.
And
there's a beautiful quote of Marcel Proust saying that writing enables us to take one world and multiply it, and it's exactly what you're saying.
Yeah. And so much of what's in the book too is about, you were talking about possibilities and generating possibilities, and so much of the kind of the work of creativity is generating new possibilities, many of which will be terrible, like that will ultimately prove futile or worthless or disastrous failures. But that ability to generate lots of different options is more than anything else, I think, the key to the creative mind at work. And in the book, I think you guys have a really nice way of framing, in a sense, kind of three mechanisms for generating new possibilities, which are, I can't remember the order you have them in, but bending, breaking, and blending, I think, is the order they're in. So I think it'd be good for our audience to kind of zoom in on each of those three and talk about what they really mean. So starting with bending.
So bending's like a theme and variation. So you take some source and you create a new version of it that introduces some novelty in some way. You're twisting it out of shape, you're transforming it. It's what a jazz pianist does with a jazz standard, in a sense, every night that they perform it. And you can do things like bend an object's size, you can bend the shape, you can basically take any quality of it, and you're holding on to the archetype, but you're reproducing it in a new way.
Right. And other examples outside of music? I mean, I could talk about music all day long. The music parts of this book are wonderful.
One of the things, one of the examples we use is about bending things that are found in nature. So, for example, you look at the way that a bird flies, and you say, okay, I want to achieve that, but I don't want to do a flapped wing aircraft, so we build fixed wing aircrafts. Or with the human heart, artificial hearts have gone from being mechanical pumps to continuous flow devices where there's no more pulse involved, but instead it just oxygenates the blood as it passes through. Anyway, these are all bends on nature. There are many ways that we bend things that we see around us. So that's the first one. The second one then is breaking, and that's where you take something, and you bust it up to see the parts of it in a new way. So you go into detail.
Yeah, for instance, cell phones. Those were originally mobile phones. Were one broadcast tower in a metropolitan area, broadcasting over a large area, and only a limited number of frequencies. So the problem with that is not very many people could make calls at the same time, and you were more likely than not to get a busy signal. And then engineers at Bell Labs said, well, wait a second, what if we broke up that continuous area into smaller cells and put a tower in each cell? And that's where the word cell phone comes from. And once they devised a way to make a handoff when you move from one cell to another and your call didn't drop, then mobile communication was born.
And then blending. So
blending is the marrying of separate things and putting them together. And again, you just look across human culture and you see humans blended with animals to create this plethora of mythological creatures, whether it's centaurs or minotaurs or mermaids. It's just, again, something that human brains are so adept and eager to do. It's just all over the place.
I was thinking another way of thinking about blending that I've written about a little bit in my own work is, I sometimes call it porting or transposing, where you have a tool or a technology or innovation that's designed in one field. And then you say, okay, let's take this thing that works for this purpose, move it over into this other field, and try and imagine what it would be like in that new context. And I think that's kind of closest to blending in a way. You're taking, in a sense, a background and a foreground and changing the background and kind of blending it. But I was thinking about this story about Apple. Of course, we could spend all our time talking about Apple. Coming up with the Apple Store. and trying to figure out the physical stores and trying to revolutionize commerce. And they went, and because they wanted to do something really different, they went and studied high-end hotels. And they're like, what is it about a 5-star hotel that people love? And they were like, oh, the concierge is this thing. People love going up to a great concierge, solve other problems. And so they were like, what would be a high-end hotel concierge in a consumer electronics store? And that became the Genius Bar, right? So it's a port. By kind of bringing it in and then kind of blending it into that new context, you get something that's radically new, but it's built between these, as a kind of blend of these original archetypes.
Absolutely. Yep. We blend concepts, we blend ideas, we blend physical things, and we blend any combination of those things together.
And do you think, is there, in terms of people's kind of practice, do you think that when someone's sitting down, okay, they're trying to figure out a new strategy, or they're just trying to solve a problem in a creative way that they're wrestling with in their own lives, is it worthwhile to think of these three processes distinctly? Is there a sequence? Do you say, like, okay, could I blend this? Could I break this? I mean, in terms of how people would approach a problem, how do you apply these ideas?
So most of that, of course, is happening on the unconscious, and we're not aware of it. But when you're ramping up, and let's say you haven't been used to tackling creative problems, it probably helps actually to think about these very consciously. And step one is to realize that whatever new thing you're going to come up with is going to be built out of the raw materials of the world around you. Mm-hmm. So you're not trying to just pull something out of the air. You're trying to start with something known and pull away from it. And so having some starting point or series of starting points is very healthy, normal, and going to be very productive. And then pretty much any creative act is going to be a mixture of all of these three things. But you can certainly ask yourself, what if I took this apart? What would any of the pieces give me? What about the archetype could be stretched or pulled or switched up in some way? Is there something that if I just mushed it together with this would give us some new capacity? I mean, the iPhone is basically mushing up all sorts of things like music players and video and internet all into a phone. And so, again, how conscious that is, probably the earlier you are in that process, the more conscious it's going to be, and eventually your unconscious will probably do most of the work.
That's great. It reminds me a little bit, I don't know if this would be in breaking or how you describe it, my other favorite kind of innovation, creativity story is the story about Brian Eno and his strategy as a producer with bands that, like, U2 likes bands or Coldplay like bands that have been super successful and have been playing together for a long time, and they're stuck in a rut, basically, because they've become kind of such iconic musicians that they sound like themselves instead of coming up with new sounds. And so when they're starting recording a new record, he has them go to the studio and he has them basically play each other's instruments for a while. Right. So he's like, Bono, you're the drummer, and The Edge, you're the bassist, or whatever it is. And they sound terrible. Like, they don't sound very good because Bono's not a very good drummer, but they sound different. And there's some little fragment of a new sound that they get from, again, it's a little bit of a risk tolerance thing too, being willing to make bad, noisy, dissonant in a bad sense kind of sounds in order to create new possibilities.
Well, and this comes up with something we talk about in the book, which is humans aren't computers. And so we don't just copy the world and reproduce it. And one of the things that Brian Eno is accomplishing is that they're doing bad imitations of each other.
Right.
And in the bad imitation, somebody says, oh, wait a second, I never thought of doing that, but that actually could be a great idea, And so I think that's part of how that works.
And there's an interesting analogy between bands and companies and innovators about this issue of how closely you stick to something that's working. And there are so many companies that we all know, whether that's Blockbuster or BlackBerry or whoever, who said, look, we've got a working idea and we're going to stick with it. And that didn't end up working. And so it turns out one of the most important things is to find ways to switch it up, to try different things. And when you look at bands like the Beatles, they did a really good job of each album putting out something that's really different and new. It didn't sound like themselves. And Tony actually is, tells the story about how Beethoven.
Yeah, that's a fascinating story.
Yeah, well, just this summer. I mean, you can tell the Grosse Fuge story, but I was just going to steal your line because I love it. This thing about how Beethoven wasn't shit. I forgot how you said
That's
it.
all right.
It wasn't that he was
Beethoven.
trying to be Beethoven.
Yeah,
It's that he was trying to not be Beethoven. And so switching it up every time.
Yeah, he wanted to surprise himself every time he composed. And it's only when we look back and we see his whole life work, we say, oh, well, that's Beethoven. But in real time as it's happening, he's always trying not to be Beethoven, and it's the same with the Beatles. They're trying not to be the Beatles and be something else.
I remember seeing the indie kind of punk band Dinosaur Jr. play a show a while back, and they were playing one of their early records, and they said when they first started playing as teenagers that they just wanted to sound like Black Sabbath, or I think it was Black Sabbath, something like, kind of early metal. And so they tried to sound like Black Sabbath, and they're like, but we kept failing, but in failing, we started to sound like ourselves. So you set out for this target, and then because you're not Black Sabbath, you end up kind of turning into this other thing, and that actually ends up being great, some of the time at least.
Yeah, there's a great title of a piece by John Cage called Cheap Imitation, in which he tries to write an Eric Satie piece and essentially fails. But in and of itself, that's a revolutionary thing that he does in his piece, And so that's in a way a lot how culture works, is we are constantly faultily remodeling things, sometimes with intention and sometimes not.
Can you tell me a little bit more about, I love this phrase, this idea of scouting to different distances. And I like it also because it's vaguely related to bees. Anything related to bees is really interesting.
It's that, one of the important things for creative people to do is to proliferate lots of options, right? So, we always imagine that our first idea about how to do something is a pretty good idea, but it's usually not, and usually it requires digging deeper and so on. So there's this emphasis on proliferating ideas, but also proliferating ideas at different distances from community standards. Why? Because you never know where the sweet spot is. You can't know what's going to stick in terms of it working or in terms of it sticking with your society around you. And so the important part is to do some things that are close to community standards and some things that are so novel that they're completely wacky. And that's how you find out what sticks. And when you look at interesting companies or creators of all types, they all have the same story where they did some things that were very close to home and they did some things that were really quite wacky and often so that it, so much so that it didn't stick, but they found where there was something successful in the middle.
And so that's a kind of deliberate practice, right? You're thinking, all right, I've spent too much time the last 3 weeks scouting at very distant, very implausible ideas. I need to get back closer to the hive. Is that's the way you imagine it?
There's a beautiful quote of Philip Guston who says, we fly out way, way far just to move 1 inch, and yet that 1 inch is a big leap. And, we have this mythology that, the most creative people, they're always on the wacky end. They're always on the wacky end. But if you're only on the wacky end, you're probably not going to have the competencies to build something that works. And so, the real truth when you look closer is they're covering this entire spectrum, and sometimes they're just tweaking what's around them or what they've already done. And other times, like David said, they're flying into way more unknown territory and covering every stage in between.
All right, last question. I love this story so much. I want you to share it. Why are humans not like sea squirts?
I have to say, I'll never forget this conversation. It was early while we were working on the book. I showed up at David's house where we were working together, and I said, so David, why do we have brains in the first place? And he said, oh, whoa, I know the answer to that. So the first function of the brain is for guided motion through the environment. And in fact, there is a sea squirt that has a brain and uses that brain to search for a nesting place. And it spends a good part of its life finding the optimal place to root itself down. And then when it finds that place, it cements itself essentially in place, and then it eats its own brain because it doesn't need it anymore. And it's hard to imagine what life as that sea squirt is like after that. Become, nature's greatest couch potato. Of course, what we then say is that human beings will never want to be like that. We never say there's a finish line. We never say there's an end point. We never say that's enough. We have this constant thirst for novelty that is just unquenchable.
And this is one of the things that's just so interesting when we look around society and civilization is that there's all these things that work just fine, like, whether it's haircuts or fashion or the make of cars or whatever, but we constantly as a society want the next thing. We're never satisfied to say, all right, we've reached the end point. This is exactly how it's going to be, and we're done. That's what characterizes our society, is this constant leaning into the future.
That's great. Thanks, guys.
Right,
everybody go read the book who's listening to this or watching. It's a terrific book.
Great honor to talk to you.
So much fun.